we've already talked about how vinyl records record audio as basically a wavy groove. That's actually pretty much what we get out of digital music as well. Only we actually have to turn them into digital bits and bytes somehow. Here's an extremely simplified diagram of the concept, right? You've got an analog waveform, and you're basically taking little slices of time and just recording what, using an integer value or floating point value, how far that signal is from the center, from 0. So it's either plus something or minus something. For a compact disc, which is still considered one of the better quality forms of digital sound recording, we've got 16 bits per sample. So that's 16 bits for each channel, left and right, so that's 32 bits for every given slice of audio. And for CDs, those slices are happening 44.1 kilohertz. 44.1 kilo dots per second. And each one of those dots is recorded as a 16-bit integer. If you're using Ableton, Logic Pro, that sort of thing, a lot of them work on like 32-bit floating point, which is just another way to record a number, right? From plus something to minus something, only you have much more fine-grained resolution. An analog to digital converter basically takes an analog sound signal, maybe the stuff that's coming out of a studio, maybe it's being recorded live from a concert, and breaks it up into these individual samples. And then you have a digital to analog converter, which you will find in almost every computer. If you've got Bluetooth headphones, there's a DAC in there. Any DJ media player will also have something that basically takes this, tries to create a reasonable approximation of this by generating voltages that match those numbers, and then runs it through a filter to restore the original analog signal. So say that we're sampling at, instead of 44.1, that's a really, really nasty number to work with, 48,000 times per second, all right? So that's 48000. For those who actually know about sampling, what frequency must that filter cut off at? The only way this filter works is if this filter is at half your sampling rate. So this is called the Nyquist frequency. So if I'm sampling at 48,000 kilohertz, I need to have a filter that runs at 24 kilohertz. However, that's a gross simplification, because can any of you design a low-pass filter that cuts off everything above 24 kilohertz and leaves everything below untouched? You can't, right? Yeah. When you implement this filter in circuitry, that filter, and this is analog circuitry at this point. We're not talking about digital circuitry when you get to this stage. This is analog circuitry. You will typically start rolling off frequencies that you're trying to get rid of in order to be able to accurately restore this. Starts a little bit lower than the maximum frequency that you want to hear. So say I'm recording at 48 kilohertz. I set my filter at 24,000, but I'm actually rolling off frequencies as high as 20,000 kilohertz, right? Now, the good news about that is that 20 kilohertz is still above the range of human hearing for most people. There's probably a few people who can hear past that point, but they may not even realize it. Dogs, of course, could probably hear it just fine. However, a lot of people can hear the difference between filters that roll off too early and filters that roll off too late. So if you roll off too late, you get a thing called aliasing, where frequencies that were never in the original signal start to appear in the very highest ranges. And rolling off too early, you're actually just getting rid of information that was in that original analog signal. So there's this thing that goes around where people say, oh, it's OK to use lower quality sources of digital music because you wouldn't be able to hear the difference anyway. Like technically, you wouldn't be able to hear anything past 20 kilohertz. That is true. But the way how these circuits are implemented means that they are actually influencing frequencies that most people can hear. The quality of your sound recordings, the source material that you're going to be playing actually does matter. This doubly matters if you're a DJ who's going to be playing on very, very, very loud sound systems, because all of those like tiny little deficiencies become amplified, literally amplified, and it makes it a lot easier for people to pick out. And they'll be able to hear the difference between, say, something that was recorded at 22 kilohertz or something that was recorded at 44.1 kilohertz. There's other sources of like noise and distortion, but I'll save that for anybody. If you're interested in really getting into the weeds on like quantization noise and stuff like that, I can. But man, that's really, really wonky stuff. There's one more device in this disco console that I want to point out, and that's the reel-to-reel tape player over there. Over here, I actually had to dig in my basement, find a cassette tape. Unlike vinyl records, cassette tapes, you can record to them. You can record to reel-to-reel tape. You can record to cassette tapes. This probably has one of my DJ mixes on it, but I don't actually have a machine that can play this back right now. So your guess is as good as mine. And pass this around if anybody is interested in looking at a cassette tape. And of course, we talked about dub plates. By the way, dub plates tend to have a second hole in them. There's a hole where the spindle goes through, where the center of the record player goes through. And then there's a second hole that was that was only used in the cutting process, where it sort of keeps the record in place so that it never slides on the platter that was spinning around. This is digital audio tape, which is, like it says, it's recording a digital signal on a tape. And one issue with this is that Sony loaded it with so much licensing and copy protection that people who actually wanted to use DATs found it very, very difficult and very expensive to use, even though the technology itself was not that expensive. So because of all those licensing fees, DAT was only used for professional sound engineers and not many other people. A compact disc like this, it looks like it's completely smooth and completely shiny, but it's actually also a series of grooves, just like analog audio. The only difference is that the grooves are not waving from side to side. They're what they call pits and lands. So they're basically a series of little pits that are cut into this aluminized layer, and it's protected with a layer of clear plastic. You might expect that a pit is like a 1 and a land is a 0 or something like that. It's actually the changes. So every time a pit becomes a land, or every time a land becomes a pit, that's a 1. Otherwise, it's a 0. And so you get binary data out of that. And there's some checksums in there as well to sort of make sure that even if there's like a scratch on the compact disc, you wouldn't be able to hear it, for instance. However, CDs are actually more fragile in my experience than records. Records, if you've got a scratch, you've got some dust in it, sure, when it goes over that part, you might be able to hear it, but the record will keep playing, typically. On a CD, a deep enough scratch into one of these could just make the entire CD unplayable, depending on where that scratch occurs. If anybody is interested in actually sort of using CDs as a source of music, you also have to keep in mind, this side is where the data is recorded. This side is where the labeling information is, so there's no data over here. This is actually the more fragile side. So don't think you're protecting your CDs by laying it on the table like this, because there's actually less plastic protecting the actual data on this side. There's only ink that's protecting this side. This side has actually got a layer of plastic to prevent it from being scratched, weirdly enough. And if your scratch gets deep enough, it's going to cut through the entire data layer, and you lose the ability to play that CD. That was one of the first CD DJ players. That might actually be the one that I was in East Campus when I was starting out. But it's the same model, definitely. In 1993, the Denon Hi-Fi audio company basically came up with this unit, the DN2000F, which was the first CD device designed for DJs. The nice thing about CDs is that you can actually burn your own. So you can make your own dub plates, just like tape. Only now they're in a form factor that's actually a lot easier to DJ with, once devices that were designed for DJing with were invented. This is actually closer to my first DJ setup. You can already see there's a pitch fader, just like a turntable. But very quickly, this becomes the standard. This is the Pioneer CDJ 500 from 1994. So just 1 year after the one that I showed earlier, where it's not only designed with a big spinny thing that a lot of DJs were kind of expecting, having come from vinyl. It's actually designed in the same size, the same sort of like back-to-front depth as a turntable. So it can actually sit side by a turntable and take just about the same amount of depth, even though it was a little bit narrower. And that made it a lot more popular. That being said, even this version didn't really catch the world on fire. A lot of DJs were still very, very, very hesitant about DJing on CDs, even though there are some advantages to it, sound quality being one of them. It wasn't until the CDJ 1000 came along, which was in 2001-ish, that they finally got to the point where DJs felt like this was a good replacement for vinyl, and its advantages overwhelmed its disadvantages. CDJ 1000 was the first one that actually let you put your hands on the platter and scratch, which I think for a lot of DJs, that was kind of the final hurdle that CD DJing needed to get across before it would be finally accepted. By the way, I have a little picture of me when I was an undergrad, like you. But you see what I'm using? I'm using a smaller version of that. This is the CDJ 100S. So that was released in 1998. So that's probably when this photo was taken as well. But my turntables are still there.
The launch of the CDJ, closely followed by the affordable CD burner, marked the initial transition from vinyl to digital playback.
I was like, wait a minute. If I can burn CDs, and there's these CD player with a pitch adjustment on it, then I can test my tracks as well.
I think that was a big change for a lot of DJs. And a lot of old school DJs didn't want to let go of the art. And there is something special about touching a piece of plastic that brings that sound.
For DJs who did produce their own music, CDJs were particularly powerful because of this whole idea. Now you don't have to pay $20 to get a dub plate cut, right? You can just burn it at home for a couple of bucks. And you can test out songs that you hadn't released publicly, and you could play it out for other people. If people study Fourier transforms, oh my God, all right. There's some post-traumatic stress going on in this room right now. If all audio is basically a bunch of frequencies superimposed on top of each other, you can take those frequencies apart. And that allows you to do things like, for instance, change the tempo of a song while maintaining its pitch, right? Like you know the original pitch of the song. Even if you're playing it slower, you know what the original pitch of the song is by performing fast Fourier transforms on that digital signal. So you can just play it back at its original frequency, but play it at a slower speed. Now, obviously, the first time they did that, it sounded like crap. And I know, I had that equipment. But it was still super cool to be able to play music at its original pitch while making it run as fast or as slow as you wanted. And we'll get to certain concepts like mixing in key, which was pretty much impossible right onto the point because we could never rely on the pitch of the song being static in the past. And now suddenly the pitch is locked. No matter how fast or how slow I play something, the pitch is always going to be the same pitch. So if I have two songs that are the same pitch, the same key of music, but playing at different speeds, I can make them play at the same speed, and it'll still sound like they're in the same key. So that's a thing that we'll get to technically later in the semester. The other thing that we can get, of course, is lossy compression. And a lot of you are going to be playing music that's encoded either in MP3 or in AAC. I think AAC was developed by Apple. MP3 was developed by the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. And the whole basic idea is that if we can take the frequencies of a particular slice of music and figure out what the loudest frequencies are at any given time, the frequencies that are right next to that loudest frequency will probably never be heard by people. That's the assumption. So what if we just got rid of that information? And that's how we get things like 10-to-1 compression ratios. You know, a CD like this holds about 74 minutes of music. That comes to about 650 megabytes of data. 650 megabytes of MP3s goes a lot more than 74 minutes. For the music that you'll be playing in this class, I would strongly recommend either 320 kilobits MP3 or 256 kilobits AAC. AAC is a little bit better, and MP3 is like an older standard, so it's not quite as efficient. But 320 kilobits MP3 sounds good even when played over a large sound system. but you're still throwing information away. Some people can hear it, some people can't, but again, it's much easier to hear the difference when you're playing it over a large sound system. The CDJ workflow is you've got a device, you bring a USB thumb drive with your MP3s on it or your AACs, and you plug it into there. That creates the audio signals that goes into a mixer. So you have multiple CDJs all producing music, goes into a mixer, and that goes out into your amplifiers and your sound systems. The turntable workflow, of course, is very similar, right? We have a turntable, we put a record on it, it goes into a mixer and goes out into the sound system. But there is a third option, which is the digital vinyl workflow, where we introduce a little box in between that connects to a computer. And this box is intercepting signals that's coming from the vinyl and substituting it with music that's on the computer and playing it out through the mixer. So digital vinyl systems, this is how I work. This is what it used to look like when it was first introduced. You have the box, which is more of a disk, I guess. All of the connectors were plugged into there. This is final scratch, and it will connect up to a computer. Typically not a desktop computer like this. It would be like a laptop. And I think final scratch was like Linux based, so it was probably not even a Mac it wouldn't even be a Mac. It would be like a Intel laptop. One opportunity with MP3s and AAC is that you could produce music maybe even that day, in that morning, and then you can send it to anybody around the world. It's a small enough file, 3 megabytes, 4 megabytes, and they could play it right away. Right? It's just a USB thumb drive. The problem with this environment where anyone can be producing music is everyone is producing music all of a sudden, and there's just too damn much music. So that's where library management comes in. I will get into this more on Wednesday, but it's important to sort of get to know organizing software, not just software that is necessary for playing back. Because you're going to have to manage so much music if you go into DJ seriously that you need to stay on top of your organization. It's no longer writing your BPMs and sticking a label on your records. It's a lot more work than that. So we'll talk about that and talk about how DJing changed once this became commonplace. All right?